Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to start with, we're talking about a lot of implements today, but at the end of the day, the implement is driven by the tractor that you purchase, right? Because we're not going to be able to run an implement if we don't have a tractor to run it. Ultimately, the first thing we need to do is figure out what size tractor we're going to buy. And if we've already made that decision, great. We now at least have a limit on what we can purchase from there on. And we want to look at that tractor in terms of its horsepower and also its size, its weight. Especially on horse farms, we need two things. We need a tractor that has enough power to pull the implements, but we need a tractor that's heavy enough to not get taken advantage of by heavy implements behind us pushing us down hills. And so we want to look at both things. We want to look at the horsepower and the weight of that tractor. And then we have sort of two big questions, sort of things to think about if a tractor is a purchase we're looking at. And that's, do I need a loader? Is that an essential thing for me? And how am I planning on using that loader? And two, do I need rear auxiliary hydraulics? Anyone ever purchase a tractor without any remotes on the rear end and then realize that almost everything that you're doing on a small farm requires rear end remotes? It's a very common need for these small tractors for a lot of doing, and it's not always something that comes on those tractors. So it's something to look at as you're purchasing for sure. In terms of sizing your tractor based upon your needs on the farm, there are some really nice calculators out there that give you some idea about the horsepower demanded by certain types of instruments. We'll touch on a couple of them today, but just so you know that there are calculators like that out there. This is one from Iowa State. It covers a breadth of things. It has a lot of things for cropping systems, but it has some things about rotary cutters, mowing, things like that as well on there. Things that are pretty useful. A no-till drill. I know Ray is going to appreciate that. That's something we'd like everyone to be able to use. And so we want to make sure that we take some time and actually look at what the implements are going to be like when we're purchasing that tractor to make sure that that horsepower is acceptable. I think for a lot of horse owners that haven't traditionally purchased a lot of tractors, this is a big purchase and a scary one. Tractors are just sort of cumbersome if you're not familiar with driving one. It feels a little intimidating starting to drive a tractor. But I just want to remind people that from a safety perspective, undersizing your tractor is far more dangerous than having it slightly oversized. And I know you're paying for the horsepower, so you don't want to oversize it in any way, shape, or form financially, but you certainly don't want to undersize it if you're the person that's going to have to operate it day in and day out. And you certainly don't want it to break down because you've undersized it. There are also a lot of nice websites out there where you can compare tractors. And so some of you have probably seen some of these websites. I'm not advertising for anyone today, but one of the things that's probably a good idea is if you're looking for a tractor and you've sort of identified a horsepower range, to look at a couple of different brands and what they have in that horsepower range that you're looking at, and then identify which ones would maybe make sense on your farm. And then you can go out and talk to some dealers and look at what's out there and available. I would say a year ago, you wouldn't have had a lot of choice, but hopefully we're getting to a little bit more supply in the market where a couple of our local dealers have some things on they're nodding at me like, finally, they don't have to say no when people come in and ask for a tractor. I know it's frustrating for them and for you. So it's really important that we take a look at what's out there in the market and we figure out which one really matches the need of our operation. And one thing that a lot of people want to have is that front loader. It's a really convenient thing to have. And even a lot of our compact and subcompact tractors right now come with a loader. Front loaders do play with the center of gravity on these tractors, though. It's one of the reasons some of the subcompacts sit nice and low to the ground so that we don't turn them over as easily. But these loaders are very large and they move our center of gravity quite a bit. You can see here, this is a pretty standard picture that we see a lot of times of a tractor. And what people like to do is they take this loader and they throw it all the way up in the air because that gives them the best visibility. And then they put all of this weight in a very weird position where it's not supposed to be. And they move the center of gravity from down here where the tires are up here over almost to where the operator's sitting. And that's one of those things that causes a lot of rollover on tractors. It's one of the things that's quite dangerous to do. This is one of our tractors where we later purchased a loader. You can see how excited we are. We took pictures as it came back to the house with the new loader on it. Not a new tractor, new loader. But one of the things that you'll notice is that most of the loaders that we purchase these days are quick attach. We can take 2 pins out, undo our attachments on our hydraulics, and we can take a loader off if we're doing things on the farm that don't require a loader. We don't need to have that weight in the field. We don't need to have that extra weight tearing up our ground in the spring if we're planting, or in the fall if it's a little bit damp. We can take that off and we can operate without that loader on there. And that's a good recommendation at times when you don't need that loader on there, for wear and tear on the loader, for wear and tear on the tractor, and for your own safety. The other thing we can do is, if we know we're going to use a loader pretty heavily and we're choosing a tractor that's a little bit smaller, we can even add things like more weight on our rear end. We can load our tires, add rear weights, do things like that to help us balance that weight out on the tractor so we're not so forward heavy, and that tractor doesn't try and pull us down the hill to try and give us a little bit more weight on those back tires that are actually driving primarily. And the last thing I just wanted to point out is this is a picture of those rear hydraulic remotes. This is one of those things that if you don't have, you're trying to figure out how to add after the fact, and can be pretty expensive as an add-on later. Not that it doesn't cost more when you purchase it initially, but a lot of times if you purchase it as part of a new tractor purchase, it's a little bit less expensive. Certainly something you're going to need for most of the implements we're going to talk about today. And the part of the implements I want to talk about is for mowing pastures. And at the end of the day, this is a really personal decision based upon the size of an operation. So how many acres are you actually going to mow? And how many acres are in each pasture? If you're mowing 10 acres and it's one pasture, it's a very different dynamic than 10 acres in 5 separate 2-acre paddocks. And the style of mower you're going to choose is going to be really different. Or it might be different. I guess I can't say that for sure. And how often are you going to mow them? Because all of this is going to play a role into how you make that decision. I see a lot of people go with the zero turn. I think this is a comfort thing for a lot of people. It's certainly not an inexpensive option. They do move fast. They move across a lot of ground. They're very effective at mowing small areas. We can get right up to a fence line very easily with them. Unfortunately, they are not really good for pulling my manure spreader out in the field or taking a no-till seed drill out. They're very useful for the one task that they are intended for, but they don't tend to do multi-purpose work on farming operations. And so that is something to keep in mind. Belly mowers. I know a number of people are starting to look at these. These are a nice option on some of those smaller compact, subcompact tractors that are out there. This is an old one. I have an old Farm All Cub. It's very useless for most things, but it has a really nice belly mower. I feel very comfortable driving it up against fence lines where I'm not necessarily so comfortable doing that with our larger bush hogs, personally. It's also got a nice center of gravity because it puts that mower right underneath you. It doesn't have any weight out behind you that can swing around on a hillside and try and drag you down a little bit on a steeper hill. And for people that are less comfortable with tractors, you know where that mower is when you're sitting in your seat, because that mower is directly underneath you. Whereas a lot of times when you have something pulling behind you on a drawbar, you might be less familiar with where that sits. The rotary cutter would be the next style. This is the one that pulls directly behind. This one is a drawbar. There's some 3-point rotary cutters, as well as some that attach to the drawbar on the back of the tractor. These units are PTO driven. Can be anywhere from about the width of the tires all the way out to about 10 feet wide. The size of that would really reflect most operations. Most farming operations would find these to be appropriately sized for their fields. The one thing I will say is that we're getting heavier. Each piece of equipment I've shown you has been a little bit bigger, a little bit more robust in terms of mowing. We need a more sizable tractor to hit, use a rotary cutter and not tear up our equipment. As a general rule of thumb, most of these bush hogs, brush hogs, rotary cutters, whatever term you want to use, take about 5 horsepower for every foot of width. And we want that width on that cutting surface to be wide enough that it's over the width of our tires of our tractor. So if our tire tractors are 4.5 feet, we need at least 5 foot on that cutting surface to make sure we cover that area that we're rolling over with those back tires to make sure that we get everything cut the way we want it so it looks nice and everything gets handled the way it needs to. And for some people out there, maybe there's people dreaming of this because they don't want to spend so long mowing, and there's some people out here with large enough operations that they do need these. The next step up would be a batwing. It has the same relative demands in terms of power as the smaller rotary cutters that are flat. But these are 15 or 20 foot wide, and for people that have bigger operations, this is the only way to efficiently get over the acres associated with that larger pasture. Seeding. This is just for you, Ray. The no-till drill. The no-till drill is a really useful thing. A lot of times we encourage people to rent one. There's a lot available through our conservation districts in this area. But the no-till drills are pretty big pieces of equipment. They're pretty heavy. So we do need a sizable enough tractor to handle one of these. And there will be some guidance out there. This is a very large one. You can see it has a grain box, a large seed box, and then a smaller seed box for our broadleaves there in the front, our clovers and whatnot. These, though, certainly have hydraulics on them. You can see them there. That means we need to have rear auxiliary hydraulics on our tractor for this to work, a good drawbar design. And we have to recognize that they're going to dig into the ground, and the deeper we want them to go, the more work it's going to be for the tractor. So we want to be cognizant that if we're only putting in something at a quarter or a half-inch deep, we have a very different dynamic and strength that we need pulling against that than we do if we're going to put something that has a 2-inch seed depth on it. So we can get away sometimes with a little bit smaller tractor for those smaller seeds that are going in pretty lightly under the soil surface versus those ones that we need to really lodge deeply in the soil. This 3-point seeder is a smaller seeding no-till option. We've seen a few of these. I've seen them at a couple dealers in this area. They're a really nice option in the sense that they're a little bit smaller, a little bit less demanding on the tractors. And for people that have smaller operations, this might be a more practical option, especially if they anticipate seeding every year on different areas of their farm. Not as readily available to rent, however. So, but certainly an option that's out there. Do have to have good 3-point systems there to make that work. And this is just a reminder, this is a set of tines here from a cultivator, but when I talk about pulling things through the dirt, I mean, there's reasons that plows and cultivators and things like that we have the term horsepower, and it's because we literally needed a certain amount of horsepower to literally pull some of these instruments through the dirt. We needed that strength. And so we have to be really careful as we make decisions that not only does it have to be able to pull it down the road and pull it back into the field, but it actually has to be able to have the strength and the capacity without really tearing up our engines to pull some of these things through the soil, especially as it gets a little bit harder sometimes in the fall. And for people that are maybe a little bit afraid that they don't have that capacity in their tractors, there are also smaller broadcast seeders, fertilized spreaders out there. It's not going to work for all seed types, but that is something else to consider. That is a fairly inexpensive purchase in the grand scheme of equipment purchases. Something nice to have on hand, and they are sized easily for different size tractors. There's different size spreaders available. It's nice if you can get it really well stabilized on your 3-point. You want to make sure you have the correct category or size in your pins to make sure it holds in there nice and stable, and that you have a good adjustable top link so that you can get it level, because that's the only way that this is going to spread anywhere remotely evenly is if we can get it all set up correctly. And that's going to take a little bit of work on our part. Last but not least, I want to just touch on manure spreaders. To me, this is one of those pieces of equipment that people don't always consider early enough. And then once they buy the manure spreader, they want the bigger manure spreader. And it's because, we have to figure out where we're going to spread the muck and how often we want to do it. And the answer is we never want to do it, but we have to do it more often than we wish we could or did. And so figuring out sort of at what regular interval you're going to have to spread, how far you have to go to the pasture where you're going to spread it, and then is the muck stockpiled outside before it gets spread? And this is a big one because generally horse stalls, when we muck them out, we have a very dry product. It's very light. And so we can really load a manure spreader with that lighter material and work our way around the fields, and we don't get in a lot of trouble. But if we rainy season, it gets very heavy very quickly, and those manure spreaders can get away from us. They have a lot of weight associated with them. This is one of the reasons that I suggest that you figure out the weight of the tractor, because a manure spreader is not necessarily so tricky to run in the sense that it's this huge thing. It is a huge thing. It's that when you take it down a hill, it has a lot more oomph behind it than the tractor might have. So we want to be really careful when we choose a manure spreader that we understand what weight of material is going into it, so we don't oversize it and then allow it to get ahead of us. There are ground-driven units out there. I see a lot of people, they're very desirable around here. I see them go at auction pretty highly priced. One of the benefits of that is that I don't have to have PTO, hydraulics, anything like that hooked up. I'm just taking it out there and manually turning it on and spreading. They tend to be a little bit smaller unit as well, which is maybe more appropriate for some of the smaller tractors that are out there on farms. The challenge is they're a smaller unit and we have to fill them more times depending on the size of the operation. There's also a lot of PTO driven units out there. These ones though do require us to have good hydraulic remotes, a good PTO connection. These are units that can very easily get sized up. There's a lot of very large units out there that are maybe inappropriate for the size of tractors that we see on most of our horse operations. But the bigger the unit, the more you can spread in one pass, the less time you have to go back to refill. So that is something to keep in mind. Is there any questions?